Homage to the Triple Gem. So hello everybody, this is Bante Joe, and a few more, 2 more weeks left of Vasa. I was actually having an interesting discussion with somebody via WhatsApp yesterday, and the discussion centered around the issue of free will and determinism. So basically what the person asked was, what do I think about the issue of free will in the Buddhist teachings? Basically, he said that there was an esteemed monk who'd said that if Brahma Sahampati hadn't urged the Buddha to teach, then he wouldn't have taught. He would have just remained in the forest. It was because of that condition that the Buddha taught. So there's a couple of assumptions that sometimes underlie the view that arises, a view of determinism that arises in Buddhism. One of them is basically that there's no self. So actually, this is the main way that people come to deterministic views in Buddhism. And when they have an idea that the Buddhist teachings on anatta mean there's actually no self, it's a teaching that there's no self. And it links up with a view that nibbana is annihilation. So basically, if a person thinks that there's just absolutely nothing behind experience, then what it means is that there can't be any agency. There can't be a person who's making decisions, choosing from a range of choices. If there's absolutely no self and everything is just conditions, then it means that only conditions are leading a person onwards. It's purely conditioned, and theoretically, what that means, which isn't explicitly spelled out in some of the views that people express when they talk about non-self, not self, or no self in this regard, is that theoretically, at some point in the distant past, there was a single cause that set all this in motion. Theoretically, it would have been whenever samsara started. And from the beginning of samsara, whatever cause set that in motion, if all there are these conditions and there's no, let's say, agency, no ability for a person to choose, it's just inevitable that things will flow from conditions, then it means that it's pre-fated, basically, that a person will either achieve nibbana or not, that they'll encounter things or not. However complex the system of causes might be, there's no room for agency. There's no room for free will there. So the Buddha really highly criticized this view. He criticized, there was this teacher named Makali Gosala, and Makali Gosala taught determinism. So the Buddha said that Makali Gosala was like a hair shirt. It was the worst of all garments. A hair shirt is hot in the hot weather, it's cold in the cold weather. It's uncomfortable, it's itchy, and foul smelling, basically. There's just nothing good about a hair shirt in terms of garments. Well, I guess it provides some shelter, but it's the worst of all garments. So in a similar way, the Buddha said that Makali Gosala, his teachings were the worst of all the sectarian teachings, basically, because he taught a doctrine of the inefficacy of deeds, basically. And the Buddha says that the Buddha, teaches a doctrine of deeds, a doctrine of action, a doctrine of Kamma, basically. And the Buddhas of the past have taught this, and the Buddhas of the future will teach this. So that hollow man Makali misrepresents the Buddha by saying these things. So a lot of the Buddhist teachings, there's an enormous emphasis on agency, in the sense that there's an emphasis that through one's efforts, through one's intentions, one has the ability to basically shape one's world. So the Buddhist teachings on anatta, or not self, they can be a little bit complicated to interpret. One of the most important aspects of interpreting the Buddhist teachings on not self or anatta is to know that the Buddha's teachings were teleological. In other words, the purpose of the Buddha teaching was to lead a person to the ending of suffering. It wasn't to teach a complete worldview, whether there's this infinite cosmos and how samsara started, and to basically give an answer to every question. So in the Buddha's time, there was a list of different questions that the sectarians of his day, or the wanderers of his day, they would have their own positions on these questions, and that would basically help to determine what their school was. Is the cosmos finite, or is it infinite? Is the Tathagata exist after death? Does he not exist after death? And there was a number of them. And a lot of these questions the Buddha refused to answer, saying that they led to a wilderness of views, a thicket of views. What the Buddha said was that he teaches suffering and the end of suffering. That's all that he teaches, suffering and the end. There's a famous sutta where the Buddha picks up a handful of leaves, of simsapa leaves, they're about the size of dimes from the forest floor, and he says, "Bhikkhus, what do you think is more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves in the trees overhead?" And the bhikkhus say, well, the leaves in the trees overhead, of course, they're more. The leaves in your hand are small. They don't even count for a fraction. And the Buddha said, in the same way, the things that I've known through direct experience are many. The things that I've taught are few. Why is that? Because they don't lead to the ending of suffering, basically. So the Buddha's teachings on not self, anatta, have to be understood in that framework, that they're meant to be something that leads to the ending of suffering. They're also something that's true, but the way that he taught them was quite nuanced. So the Buddha's teachings on a self, basically for there to be a self, there has to be whatever the self possesses. So in other words, the self has to have characteristics that we give it in our imagination. Either it's, however subtle, whatever we think of it, whether we think of it as consciousness or awareness, which I often criticize in these Dhamma talks, whatever we think about what the self might be, more or less, is that conception is an attachment. That conception is a characteristic that we give the self, and that is a possession of the self. So the Buddha said, for there to be a self, there has to be the possessions of a self. And when we look at his teachings on dependent origination, when we see the way that a self gets created, it's basically through craving, clinging, and becoming. There's contact, there's feeling, there's craving, there's clinging, there's becoming. The Buddha calls this process ahankara mamankara. This means I-making and my-making. In other words, the self in Buddhism, the way that the Buddha teaches about self and not self, is that the self is a process. It's something that we create. And this creation of a self through becoming leads to birth, aging, death, etc. And that's what leads to suffering. So when he talks about a self, he's talking about something that we do. It's an activity that we do. A person clings on to something in the aggregates, and as a result of that clinging, they're reborn somewhere, whether it's in a refined place or a not refined place. It's because they've created an identity through their craving and through their attachments, and that leads them onwards after death. So when we look especially at the Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha talks about self-identity views, and in those views we can see how basically the Buddha is defining a self in terms, not in terms of like an ontology, like, there is absolutely nothing after experience or whatever it might be. He's talking about different views that people undertake as actions. So we can also learn to look at views as an action that we undertake that leads to craving and clinging, etc. So the Buddha's teachings on not self are meant to lead a person to let go of everything that binds them to samsara. And samsara is basically called the all. The eye, the nose, the ear, the tongue, the body, and the mind are what's called the all. In other words, there's nothing that we experience that's outside of this. This is the entirety of a person's experience. So as for what lies beyond the all, that past the all, or when one lets go, one has overcome one's attachment to the all, then one attains nibbana. But nibbana, the Buddha doesn't say much about it. You can't elaborate on it. There are a couple of suttas where he talks about a type of consciousness called anidasana vijnana. In one of the suttas, he's very clear that it's not known through the allness of the all. And also, anidasana is one of the epithets for nibbana. So there is a type of consciousness that the Buddha describes that's not known through the sixth sense media, but that is also not self. Because to have a self, a person has to be creating an identity through craving or clinging to one or another of the aggregates, to a certain reality that's in samsara, which is what makes the whole thing describable. What lies beyond the all can't be described. It's beyond proliferation. These different suttas in which Sariputta has a kind of back and forth conversation with Mahakotita, I think. And there's one sutta where Mahakotita questions him basically about what lies beyond the sixth sense base. He says, you've gone too far. That's as far as the limit of papancha, the limit of objectification or proliferation. That's as far as you can describe. So the Buddha's teachings on not self are not an ontological statement that nibbana is annihilation or there's nothing beyond them. So what this means is that he leaves room for agency, but he doesn't explicitly describe how that happens. So another important aspect of the Buddha's teachings is that there's these different questions, and some questions should be put aside. So questions like, who am I? Where did this being come from? Those lead to views like I have a self, or I have no self, or the self is the knower here and now who basically is just watching things. And these views, again, lead to a wilderness of views, a thicket of views. So I had this little back and forth with this this person, and they asked a follow-up question as well, and they said, well, there's different nuanced views of determinism. One of the nuanced views of determinism is that the conditions themselves are impersonal, but that the actions that we can undertake within whatever wiggle room is allowed through these impersonal conditions hedging us in, those actions are a form of agency. We do have this kind of small wiggle room. There's another interesting aspect of the Buddha's teachings on Kamma. So Kamma is intention in the Buddha's teachings. And basically, whatever we feel or experience or contact, the Buddha really emphasizes the role of Kamma in that. It's the most powerful force in the universe. He doesn't explicitly spell out like an answer a question, like is everything that we experience a result of the Kamma that we've done? Is it a result of the Kamma that we've done in the past and that we're doing right now? In other words, are the people that we meet, are the things that they do to us, does our mind incline towards bad things and attract other people towards doing bad things to us? Do we end up in situations in which people who want to do good or bad things have the opportunity to do that? Like what's the role of our intention in that? The Buddha doesn't explicitly spell that out so as to give like a definite answer to an absolute type of agency or an absolute type of determinism, or if there's room for randomness in the whole system or not. What is interesting in the canon is that there's a couple suttas in which it comes across, sometimes strongly, that basically the whole of the world is led by the mind. In other words, there's a certain sense in which a person creates their world. Again, it's not explicitly spelled out how it is, but there's the famous phrase in the Dhammapada, all mind is the forerunner of all things, basically. Things or phenomenon in that sutta is Dhamma. And Dhamma can either mean like the mental aspect that creates consciousness, where you have an internal mind faculty, you've got an external Dhamma, or like a thought, or whatever it might be, some kind of mental phenomenon, and as a result you get mind consciousness. Or Dhamma can just mean anything, any type of phenomena. So one has to choose how to translate that. And there's other suttas, especially in the Sutta Nipata, which seem to lean towards almost like a type of idealism. But the Buddha doesn't totally spell this out, that it's an idealism, that everything is the mind. But he says that it basically is a recommendation to look at the world like all this is unreal. Everything in the world is unreal. So there can be this, again, it's not totally spelled out, there is this leaning in the canon that the actions that constrain us coming from the past, those may be largely or entirely influenced by intentions that we have made in the past. In other words, the thoughts that we have now, the feelings that we have now, the body that we have now, that's old Kamma. That kind of thing comes from intentions, inclinations that we've made in the past, and things that we're doing in the present to a certain extent. However, there are also these mysterious aspects of Kamma where the mind actually leans towards things. It inclines towards either good or bad things. These kind of inclinations may also be an aspect of Kamma. So those are also constraints. Like, where does our mind lean to? I mean, all the opportunities can be there for a person, but whether or not they take them, some people have these opportunities sitting right in front of them and they don't want them. They want to take it, but they don't. In some cases, this can be because of their blockages, because of past bad Kamma. There's also mysterious aspects to Kamma where it can almost be like the world pulls things together for a person to meet their fate. And there's some aspects of quantum physics that seem to lend support for this view. So, in other words, the things that constrain us in the past, in the Buddha's teachings, the leaning of the canon is that these things can be largely, in part, maybe some randomness, we don't know, or totally, as a result of intentions that we've made in the past. The past Kamma that or the conditions now that hem us in may actually be our own doing, to a large extent or to a whole extent. Then we also have the Kamma that we do in the present, like whether or not we make how we make decisions about the things that we experience. So in other words, there's this leaning in the Buddhist teachings away from determinism and towards a path of effort, towards a path of agency, towards a path of kamma and deeds. In other words, the whole world, everything that we experience, could be seen to be a result of what we've done and what we're doing right now. So one of the interesting aspects of this conversation with this young man was that looking at views in terms of the action as an action, one can look at the ways that these different views incline the mind. Like, if everything is a result of what we've done, then it gives what we've done, what we're doing, more or less, and it gives a huge amount of responsibility to a person. What they do is the most important thing in the world. Actually, their whole world is what they do, what they think. That's the most important news. That's what's happening in the world. Whatever else is happening outside that one may perceive, how one reacts to it and what deeds one undertakes with the intention, those are the most important things. The view that, there's just determinism, nobody can choose, or that, there's partial determinism, we can choose some things and the rest we're hemmed in by, this can lead to a type of like defeatism. Because there can be these actually really intense situations that a person encounters in their practice where they basically can't see any way out. It's just they're totally hemmed in on all sides. And if you talk to enough practitioners, you can hear stories about this. Some things are pretty intense. So the Buddhist teachings on Kamma in this sense are liberating. Whatever I'm experiencing right now, that's probably to a large extent because of intentions that I've taken in the past. And what I do in reaction to those right now will shape my future to a certain extent. So I have the power to find a way out. One way or another, there can be a way out. One can think this way. One's mind can incline more in this way. So there are situations which are kind of like predetermined in the Buddhist teachings. For example, if a person has killed their mother, killed their father, killed an arahant, shed the blood of a tathagata, created a schism, then they go to hell no matter what. It does seem that there's some wiggle room that they can make that worse or make it better based on actions that they do afterwards, but definitely they're going to hell. Then there's also, if a person has become a stream enter or any of the noble attainments, then at least if they become a stream enter, they will attain Nibbana within 7 lifetimes. So it's inevitable. So what we seem to have actually in the Buddhist teachings on Kamma is this kind of constraint. There's a constraint from the actions that a person has taken in the past. I can never become the president of the United States. I hope they still have presidents. But I could never become the president of the United States because I wasn't born there. So that's a constraint of my past Kamma. It's just something that's not possible. So, however, what I do right now will determine my future Kamma. So this is something that there is wiggle room for. So there is this kind of mixture between determinism, what you might say in some sense determinism, and free will in Buddhism. But the emphasis is on free will, is on agency. Even these actions coming from the past, large extent or maybe a complete extent, come from things that we've done. And what we do now will help to shape our future. So the Buddha's teaching that there's this path of action, there's this path of views, there's this path of deeds, it's very important because it's this fact that makes it possible for liberation, for a person to achieve liberation. That what we experience right now is a result of deeds that we've done, and through actions that we take now, we can find a way to escape the suffering that we have right now and escape deeds entirely. Because actually, that's where the Buddhist path leads. When we talk about not self, there's not self and contemplating things in terms of not self. At the end of that path, that leads to everything. And once that path is complete, there's nothing that one can say about it. So the word anidasana, actually, to translate Pali well, you have to basically look at how it's used in the context of the canon. And that word anidasana is used in the context of somebody trying to draw shapes in space. In other words, you can't draw shapes in space because space is formless, and a person would only reap their share of weariness and disappointment. This comes from the simile of the saw. So you can see that anidasana basically means like formless, although the actual literal translation is almost like not seen, or dasana has this relationship to sight. So there's nothing that one can say about something that has no form, like space. And the Buddha also gives a metaphor of a sunbeam that doesn't land, or a beam of light that doesn't land. I mean, if it doesn't land, it's not manifest, it's not visible. So you can't say that it exists, it doesn't exist, etc. In that sense, it hasn't reflected off of anything. And in a similar way, the Buddha gives a simile of fire. In the Buddha's time, fire was said to be something that clung to its fuel, and as a result of clinging to its fuel, it came into existence. So this clinging, this upadana, that is the same metaphor. This craving, clinging, becoming. That's the same metaphor as fire. So when a fire's gone out, one can't say which direction. It's gone north, south, east, west. It's just gone out. But it's not annihilated. So the Buddha's teachings point towards something like this. Ajahn Thanissaro has given a lot of these points, especially a brilliant book, Paradox of Becoming. And so a person uses becoming, a person uses deeds to overcome deeds themselves and to find something that lies beyond. But to do this, it's really important to have a view that the Buddha's path is a path of action, it's a path of deeds, it's a path of Kamma. That leads to the end of deeds, that leads to the end of Kamma, and that leads to a happiness that doesn't change.